Good morning. My name is Richard Bailey. As you can see, it's the panel that we have this morning. A couple of familiar names: Adrian Myberg, Steve Brown, Marius van Wyk, Patrick Gordon, and myself. Guys, I'm not going to waste too much time unless there's something specific somebody wants to say first. I'm going to jump straight into the questions as I have them. And these are questions that came straight from, I think, Patrick, your Tech Talk a while ago. A lot of these questions are from yours. Yes, and a lot of them as well, so that pertain to your Tech Talk as well as to your specific products. But there are a lot of generic questions here as well, and I'm sure between all of us we'll get through them. Do you need a PRV for instantaneous gas geyser?
Okay, morning guys. The question is straightforward. The requirement for PRV, if you look at the rating on these instantaneous gas geysers, some of them can handle higher rating, being non-storage, being the pipe being heated up. It's more of a pipe being heated than an actual cylinder. But the question shouldn't be around the PRV. There's two standards, or there are two references to the water into a property or onto a property. The one says that you can only have a maximum of 600 kPa. So whether the manufacturer in their little booklet or whatever tells you they can go 800 or 1000 kPa is besides the point. The standard says you can only have 600 kPa going into a building. But more importantly, and guys, I noticed there was a couple of gas questions there. The biggest thing that we need to bear in mind, especially if you're going to be signing a COC on an installation, 10252 part 1 says, in most cases, the instantaneous water heating process is triggered by a differential pressure switch and an orifice restrictor. This causes higher downstream hot water flow pressure drops than storage water heaters. Therefore, pipe design, pipe sizing, and simultaneous use of fittings shall be considered and calculated to ensure sufficient hot and cold water balanced at terminal fitting. We've had 5 or 6 engineers submit the funniest drawings and designs. The major issue shouldn't be around the PRV. It should be about how do you balance your hot and cold water, because if it's not balanced and you sign a COC, you're going to have to answer for that. So my suggestion would be, yes, 600 kPa would be, or a PRV would be required for the whole installation. But when it comes to the actual gas geyser, you should be more concerned around the balancing of the hot water and the cold water than what you are about the PRV.
It's always the same. It comes back to the same thing pretty much every time, revolving around gas geysers and flow rates. Okay, I was recently on a site where 4 units or dwellings share one PRV. Should every unit or dwelling have its own PRV? I think that's a very, very simple answer. Absolutely right, it should.
If we have a look and see, the SANS legislation says wherever water enters the building with separate occupation, there must be a specific isolating valve. We're not allowed to have an isolating valve between the geyser and the PRV valve. So yes, you would have to have each one its own specific, and then downstream of that, downstream of all your high flow items, like your garden taps and so forth, you would have your PRV balancing the whole domestic installation then.
Yeah, and in addition to that as well, Patrick, that's quite right. So what you're saying is that you can't have shutoffs, and the fact that you have to be able to shut off individual geysers means that you need shutoffs there, which means you can't have a PRV before those shutoffs. So that's the one aspect. The other aspect is that if you look in 10254 and under the subsection specific requirements, it will tell you that a pressure geyser system consists of a shutoff valve, a PRV, a TP, 2 vacuum breakers, etc. And so the PRV or the PCV is part and parcel of every single geyser installation. You can't have one PCV controlling 6 geysers without any additional PCVs, if you know what I'm saying. So you can have a bulk PCV, no problem, but not one for the purpose of controlling 4 geysers.
The other thing we need to remember is that when you're looking at 4 units, that means that those units need to be sub-metered, or you need to allow for a water meter on each of those units. It's a legal requirement. But then 10252 part 1 says that you can only have a PRV downstream of the water meter. So if you have one PRV before the water meter, that's not going to do the trick. You need to be downstream of those individual water meters. So yes, I agree with what you're saying. I'm just saying that if you are sub-metering, you need to make sure that your PRV actually comes in after that individual water meter.
Must the garden tap be independent of the house water feed? It's a little bit ambiguous, the question, but I think we know what it means.
Yes. Now, Patrick mentioned it earlier when it comes to high draw-off points or high draw-off, like a garden tap or like a flush valve for a toilet from the mains, then the requirement is straightforward. You need to have all of those high draw-off points. The position of a pressure control valve shall be downstream of all high draw-off like garden taps and mains-fed toilet flush valves. So I'm hoping that was the gist of the question, or that's the way I read it. So it's down to making sure that your garden tap and your junior flush masters or any of these high pressure flush masters actually get installed before that PRV.
Yeah, essentially it cannot be installed, it cannot be supplied by balanced cold pressure. That's
Yes.
the gist of it.
You get maximum pressure into it, and we don't want to balance it after that. Yes.
Yeah. Marius, are you awake? I mean, are you with us? Because well, otherwise you're just slacking off there in the corner, man.
I'm listening.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm listening.
Maybe you want to take one or two of these. So this is also quite a generic question, but please elaborate on upsizing expansion pipes on TP valves, and does this apply to PRVs? It's not a answer that everybody wants to hear, but if you look at 10254, yes, the requirement for the upsizing and the 3 bends and the 4 meters and the 9 meters, that whole scenario applies to both TP and expansion overflows. So that was the question that was asked. That's the answer that is given in terms of what the standards say. We can have discussions, guys. I'm sure you'd agree. We can have discussions outside of this forum regarding whether the PRV overflow needs to be subject to that same thing, but the standards require it. So the answer that is yes.
What I've been noticing with some audits lately is that we made that resolution where we said the guys can use on the expansion relief valve, when it's inside the roof, we can use a PVC, an approved PVC type pipe for the outlet. And then obviously they must adhere to the distance exactly the same as for the TP valve when going out. But what I've noticed is that as soon as they take it outside the house and then they want to take it down to the, so that it doesn't drip on a walkway or something, they take it down the wall, they still continue with the PVC pipe. So something they must also bear in mind when they are using this is not to use the PVC pipe outside because it's not approved to use outside, and they'll have to go to a copper pipe. But they must adhere to the distance, and they must look at it, because sometimes you come out of the roof, it comes out about 3 meters, and you go down, and are you extending it with another 2 meters going down, or even if it's a longer distance. So that's something they must be cognizant of. And then obviously make sure if they're taking it to somewhere where it is visible. That is a very important one as well. Thanks, Richard.
Okay, cool, man. All right. So the next question is, if the geyser is 15 meters above a 400 kPa PRV, can you install a 600 kPa PRV, or should you rather move the PRV closer to the geyser? Who wants to tackle that?
Okay, if I can jump in there, that was part of last week's presentation there also.
Yes.
Remember that for every meter, you're losing 10 kPa. So on 15 meters, you're going to be losing 150 kPa. Your valve is already only going to give you 300 kPa to set pressure, so you're only going to be getting about 150 kPa out, and that's before any friction losses in the pipe. So yeah, you shouldn't have it that far away. It would be much better to rather move the PRV closer. As to whether you can just put a 600 kPa in, it all depends on what the rating of the geyser is that you've got in there. You're not allowed to put a 600 kPa pressure control valve on a 400 geyser, even if you are going to be losing that pressure. So you'd have to rather than take it much closer.
Patrick summed it up quite nicely. You can't have it, you can't mix and match. That's quite clear. the PRV has to match the pressure rating of the geyser. You cannot mix and match that. You cannot MacGyver it to change it, because anything can happen down the line, and people subsequent to you, after you, can get confused and that sort of thing. And that's one of the bigger problems that that goes wrong when things are put in for one purpose and somebody further down the line doesn't recognize what that purpose was and changes things up. Anyway, I digress. So it says here, do we still need to use a banjo valve on a builder's warehouse B-rated heat pump / solar compatible geyser? I'm not quite sure what that meant. I put it in there, Patrick. I knew that it came from your tech talk, but I wasn't sure what context it was in. I suppose it was to do with either the connection of a solar system or a heat pump system.
Yeah, I'm not sure what a builder's warehouse B-rated heat pump compatible geyser looks like, so it's not
Maybe
one
I
that
can
I'm
help.
familiar with. Yeah.
I think normally the geyser that is stocked by Builders Warehouse, I think, is a heat-tech. So it goes about that it has an extra port. So that's why they call it a solar compatible geyser. So the question would be is, do you use a banjo valve for the return on your solar system or the return on the heat pump? It would not be necessary if the geyser has a return port. So at the back, it has a return port, and it's the same position as what the anode is on the other side. But just adhere to whatever the heat pump manufacturer states in terms of when it goes into the geyser, if it has a little pipe that goes down to prevent the mixing. So it depends on where it goes into the geyser. But if it's this specific geyser that he talks about at Builders Warehouse, it would go into the center and it would suffice to work. But remember, it still then constitutes a retrofit in a certain sense, because it's a solar compatible geyser, and it does not really constitute a system which has been tested with a panel. So it's a retrofit geyser with a panel then.
Okay, yeah, there's quite a lot that can be said about that, and I think we can actually spend 15 minutes on that. So let's rather move on. Patrick, I think these next two questions are pretty much about the same thing. Question 1 says, will a Kalefi valve warranty be upheld when we separate the PCV and the expansion valve? And then continuing on from that, once you've done that, can one install a pressure meter on the PCV in place of the expansion valve when the expansion valve is installed at the geyser?
Yeah, that was actually answered in the Q&A last week. But yes, we will uphold the warranty, and you can put a pressure gauge there, no problem.
Right. Okay. When interconnecting geysers, how many vacuum breakers do we use? So unless anybody wants to take this, I'm happy to say that look, going back to 10254 and you and what constitutes a geyser installation, it's very clear that a geyser installation consists of, you know, certain things. And so how long is a piece of string? So how far apart are these geysers? And for safety's sake, we're going to include a hot vacuum breaker, a cold vacuum breaker for each geyser. That is the story. So even if you have a hot a pre-feed geyser going from hot out to cold in of the next geyser, that doesn't mean that you can only have one vacuum breaker on that little connection. It means that you need your hot outlet vacuum breaker on the first geyser, and you need your anti-siphon loop cold inlet vacuum breaker on the second geyser, unless anybody wants to add something to that.
Richard, can I just jump in there? If we look, or we suggest, or we refer the guys to figure 8 in SANS 10.10.6 when they're talking about pre-feeding or preheating system. If we look at that there's a nice diagram of what those preheater systems look like. And they've got the requirement, like you said initially, was that you need one on the hot and cold. On that preheater solar system, they actually share one down the middle between the hot out and cold in. But there's a nice diagram, gives you all the elements, all the descriptions, all of that in figure 8 in 10.10.6. You can have a look at that.
Okay, I actually wasn't talking about, I don't think the question was asking about solar specifically, but yeah, okay, so 10.10.6 would be the pre-feed
Yes, so that indicates
Okay.
that, but other than that, if you look, you can't have too many of them. So if you have one hot and cold, the requirement is you need one on the hot and cold supply. So if you have one on each, I mean, you're covered. I'm just saying that if it's preheat or they're going to go onto something like that, there is a diagram indicating what it should look like.
Yeah, bearing in mind that look, the role of a vacuum breaker on the anti-siphon loop is a backflow prevention device. The whole thing is, and on for the hot side, it's anti-suction or anti. It allows for the ingress of air so that there's no vacuum on the tank. So each has a specific role, and they only work when they are installed in the correct places. So for example, you can't have a vacuum breaker on the hot outlet of a geyser close to the proximity of the hot outlet of the geyser and quite far away from the anti-siphon loop of another geyser, and then call that and say that that's fulfilling both functions. There would be, it's again, it's a little bit of a gray area, and how long is a piece of string? So how far apart are these geysers, etc., etc. I mean, if you look at what the requirements are in terms of how many geysers you're allowed in a ceiling, one for every 3 trusses. So you can't put 2 geysers right next to one another in a ceiling in any event. You have to separate them quite far apart, and in that case, you can't have just one vacuum breaker between the 2 geysers. I think, yeah. So we might be spending a little bit too much time on one question. It's one of my problems, guys.
Yeah.
My apologies.
Richard, I think you mentioned something very important there, and it goes about the support. If you're doing geysers in series, that's something we can touch on later, maybe specifically again, is that those 2 geysers can't be right next to each other, and that happens a lot. We find that a lot. So that's something the guys must be aware of, is about that support.
Okay, next question is, what is the standard distance between the water geyser, well, the geyser and the PRV for 400 and 600? And I think it's manufacturer recommendations, isn't it?
Yeah, if we have a look at the SANS, it's not very specific. It does mention that on 100 kPa, it cannot be further away than 2 meters or 2 meters below. And as we mentioned in last week's one, it is manufacturer specific, but SANS does say that it must be as close as possible. So yeah, don't go too far away. Try and keep that as short as possible, that section.
Yeah, 100%.
I've spoken to manufacturers on that. Maybe I can come in and just add there. The one on Cobra, for instance, the Cobra master flow valve is very specific. As Patrick said there, on 100 kPa is within 1 meter of the geyser. 200 kPa, which is rarely used, is 2 meters from the geyser. And on that one specifically, on the 400 kPa is 10 meters. So that is where this 10 meter argument comes in a lot. That manufacturer specifically has a 10 meter on their 400 kPa, and they don't have a 600 kPa. So I spoke to the other manufacturer, QuickHot. They had no specifics on it. There's also nothing in the specifications on the valve. And I spoke to the factory, and they said they do not have a problem if it is further than 10 meters. But obviously, you must, bear cognizance. You can't go and put it up like 30 and 40 meters away from the geyser. So that was the only one that I could find a specific on, was on the Cobra master flow valve, that they specified it must be not further than 10 meters.
Okay, the next question is quite long, but in essence, when the valve was installed close to the geyser, it was water hammering and constant discharge of the overflow, and then he moved the valve to the outside of the building, and that stopped for some other strange reason. The question is, can there be a case where the PRV is installed too close to the cylinder? And I can tell you that's a no.
From my side, yeah, he mentions the original system was unbalanced. So obviously when he moved the valve outside, then they balanced the system, and then it would take the water hammer and so forth away and the excessive discharge. But yes, as you say, you cannot have it too close to the geyser.
So okay, good point. So the unbalanced nature of the system meant that the valve was experiencing probably a little bit of back pressure, or there was a cross connection somewhere, and somehow or another, by moving that valve outside, they prevented that from happening for some reason. You know, plumbing is one of those things. It's a case-to-case basis, and everything will have to be looked at. But the question is, the answer is no. You can't have something too close to the geyser, a PRV too close to the geyser. Is there any need to put a shut-off valve if you have a multi-valve? So the question there is, does one need a separate and dedicated shut-off valve before the PRV, even if it is a multi-valve? Somebody want to take that?
Yeah, definitely. SANS 10252 very clearly shows that there must be a specific isolating valve, as I said, where you have water entering a building with separate occupation. And then it carries on to say that if there is an integral shut-off, that is not to replace a specific isolating valve. So you must still have the specific isolating valve. And the reasoning behind that is, if you need to replace that valve, where do you shut off the water? You need to have that specific isolating valve where you can isolate everything to remove the pressure control valve.
Yeah, okay, quite right. If the PCV is next to the geyser, what happens to the cold water pressure? Does it balance, or if not, how to balance it? Guys, I think that's a basic, it's a plumbing 101 configuration situation. So the basic premise of balanced water, and we know that balanced water pressure isn't as simple as just saying, well, I've taken it off after the PRV, but the basic premise of it is that the hot and cold water is the same pressures, and in other words, the pressures are regulated by, in most cases, a common PCV. In other words, you simply T and take the cold water supply to the points off after the PCV. That doesn't constitute 100% balanced pressure, but anyway, that's the situation. So the question is, what about if the PCV is close to the geyser? How do I balance cold? Well, you tee it in afterwards, and so I don't think I need to elaborate on that, and I don't think we're going to go into residual dynamic pressure and all the rest now, Patrick. But yeah, guys, you tee the cold in after the PRV or the PCV, and that's how you balance cold. Okay, so this question pertains to an extra overflow, well, the expansion valve situated close to the geyser, presumably in a situation where you have the PRV somewhere. Then you have a mandatory shut-off valve to maintain the geyser close to the geyser, and because of that, you'd now need to install an additional relief component between that valve and the geyser. And the question is, what do you do what are the overflow requirements for that expansion valve? I think I'm right in saying that it is exactly as per a normal expansion relief overflow would be.
Yes.
Exactly. SANS doesn't specify if it's a second one, it changes. It stays exactly the same.
This is another strange question. If you install geysers in series, do you still have an expansion valve, even though there are two safety valves? Does somebody want to just explain the difference in pressure ratings and opening pressures between the safety valve and expansion valve, perhaps?
Okay, your safety valve is rated at 1.5 times the rating. So if it's a 400 kPa, it would actually only open up for pressure at 600 plus minus 10%. So you're looking at between 540 and 660. Whereas now, if it's your relief valve, it opens up at 100%. So that is 400 kPa. And if your geyser is 400, that's what you're going to have in. So no. Doesn't matter how many geysers, each geyser must have its own safety valve, and then there must still be an expansion valve for that installation.
Yeah, quite right.
I think I just read that question as well. I think there's a confusion. An expansion valve is not a safety valve or TP valve. They are two different types of valve and have two different functions. The one works on expansion, and the other one works on temperature. So just be aware of that, and I think that is what this person has indicated here. Is I think he's confused the two.
Yeah, I think what he's asking is whether or not a safety valve can be used as fulfill the role of an expansion valve? And as Patrick said, the two scenarios where TP opens up, one is temperature, yes, but the other is pressure. But the pressure opening, or the opening pressure of a safety valve, is 150%, as you say, plus minus 10%. So that means that the that the geyser will not be able to expand until it's reached 150% of its rated pressure rating. So in no circumstances ever can a safety valve be looked at as an expansion relief valve, ever.
Correct.
Okay, so what KPA can we expect on a 400 and 600 PRV after the valve? I think you've answered that already, Patrick.
Yes, it's on any valve, it's a percentage. So you're looking at between 75 and 80% of the rating of the valve. So on a 400 kPa, it's between 280 and 340. And on a 600 kPa, you're looking at about 450 kPa, somewhere around there.
If my geyser is being fed from a booster pump, should I eliminate the PRV and install expansion valve close to the geyser, especially small 0.35 kilowatt booster pump? Once again, we go back to what is allowed in the standards. The standard says your closed or unvented geyser shall have a pressure control valve. The only place where you can forego the pressure control valve if you have a closed geyser installed in a building that was designed and plumbed to supply cold water from a tank system at some point. So and that then must be at a specific height and must not exceed the rating of the geyser, blah blah blah. But that's the only time that you can forego a PRV. In all other situations, even though this booster pump won't ever over pressurize the geyser, what happens if somebody takes that booster pump out and hooks it up to the mains because they just don't know any better? Now you haven't got a PRV and there's a problem. Guys, please jump in anytime. On a double-story building, can you use 600 kPa PRV at ground floor and then 400 kPa PRVs at 2 geyser installations?
If you're looking at 600 kPa, which Patrick just said, now you're probably looking at 450 after the valve, and then you install 2 more on a double story, which means you've gone up another 5 or 6 meters. So from 450 you'll be down some more, and then you have 400 kPa PRVs at the bottom one. Strictly speaking, if you look at PRVs, the bottom one's not going to have any function whatsoever, because I mean it's also like a non-return. If you can only go through it in one direction. So once you've put the 2 400s in at the top with that reduced pressure, you're probably only going to have those top 2 working. You're not going to have any expansion or any movement on the bottom. If I read the question correctly, I'm trying to figure out what exactly the intention or what the purpose is.
It could run to unbalanced pressure if depending on where the cold water draw is.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I can't figure out exactly what the building is like. It might be worth having an actual look at the problem. But the way it's written there, you've got 3 PRVs on 2 geysers. You might not. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, the 600 might be just there to balance or to bring the overall pressure down to the rest of the, to the cold water system before, I don't know. But look, there's nothing.
The geysers might be at 400 and you're cold at 600. So there's something amiss there, or there's maybe some information that was left out of the question. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, fair enough. Incomplete question, incomplete answer. Okay. I think this next one has been asked and answered. It shouldn't be more than 20 meters away. There's no scenario where that's okay, I don't think. Okay. With regards to bracketing, I think this has been asked before as well. It rings a bell. What is the standard spacing of hanger brackets for 100 mil galvanized mild steel water pipe to soffit? In other words, suspended galvanized pipe, 100 mil. And there you can see table 21. That's in SANS 10252/1. And it gives you maximum spacing supports. So it can be less, but it cannot be more. For metallic pipes installed horizontally, and there you can see non-vertically, which is horizontally, 65 to 150 mil diameter pipe, 4 meter. So that's maximum. It's not. You probably serve better served to go even a little bit less than that.
Just to touch on that, I actually answered that question about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And what happened there was that I did some calculations in that, and we were looking at around 70 kilos between that 4-meter spacings there. So the emphasis wasn't as much on the spacing, it was on what type of fixation you would use to have 70 kilos supported on those 2 brackets. And then we, like semi from years ago when we actually did some of those work, if you go from on a 6-meter length of galvanized pipe, you go 1 at the socket, 1 in the middle, you're actually around 3 meters apart. But at least then when you're turning a socket or a fitting onto the thread, then you are within proximity of where the thing is being supported. So yes, I think we have answered that one before.
Yeah. Ruben, I'm not sure if there are any questions that are coming through.
Yes, Richard, we do have questions that did come through now. The question is, what is the maximum distance for a master box to be installed away from a geyser, and what is the pressure loss over that distance per meter?
Okay, master box is Cobra. There it was already said that Cobra specify no more than 10 meters away. And on 10 meters, if it's 10 meters below, you're losing 100 kPa.
Okay.
If it's just a horizontal, it all depends on what piping and what the friction loss is on that pipe. So it's difficult to say exactly, but from height-wise, you'd be losing about 100 kPa.
The next one is in a complex that has multiple toilets, showers, etc., like a gym, how do you issue a COC? Somebody want to take that? I can.
Yes, I can do that. First of all, the question must be: is this a newly built gym?
Let's assume
I think
so.
then, if it's a newly built one, then obviously it's multiple toilets. You are going to on your COC, you're going to specify at the installation details, and that is so important. I'm still seeing a lot of new buildings where it just says new installation or a new bolt or something like that. It specifies details. So you can even have an addendum to your COC where you specify that the top floor has 4 toilets, the second floor has another 4, and the other 2 is at the ground floor, whatever the case may be. But you specify the amount of toilets that are on there. And then maybe if the question was directed towards it's a current gym and it's being sold, and the owner has now requested a COC, obviously the COC is not designed for that purpose, so it will be another scenario. So it just goes about everything that is being installed by you plumbing wise on that gym would be on that COC in the installation details.
Okay, so the next question I think is again been asked and answered, but let's just address it again. The question is, can I install a control valve or a shutoff valve between the tank and the PRV? The answer is no. You may not install any kind of shutoff or flow control valve between the expansion relief of a geyser and the geyser itself. So I think let's just so that's been asked and answered. And last one, can 2 next to each other? I'm just looking. Here we go. Can 2 geysers be installed next to each other if an architect / builder has built a reinforced platform for the geyser? So so that goes around the 1 geyser per 3 trusses question, doesn't it? So if let's say an engineer has designed and built a purpose-made platform to support 2 geysers next to each other, thoughts?
Yeah,
Well,
I
there will
think
be
it's designed in that manner, and there's a competent person that's designed it, and they're taking the responsibility for it, then there shouldn't be a problem. So again, we say it's been designed. If it's been designed by that competent person and the various structures and stuff have been put in place, then it shouldn't be a problem. It's been designed by a competent person.